On the pasuk V'hinei anachnu ma'almim alumim b'soich hasoda, which is of course in the dream that Yosef has, where he's gathered, all himself and the Shvatim are gathering piles of grain in the field. Rashi translates the words ma'almim alumim. He says kitargumoy, as the Targum renders it, ma'aserin asorin, which we'll soon see means tying knots. Then Rashi says omrin, which in other words we're referring to sheaves of grain. Then Rashi says, so too we find the pasuk noisei alumoisov, carrying his sheaves. V'chamoyu, says Rashi, and so too in the language of the Mishnah we have ho'alumois noitelu machriz, referring to a person that found some sheaves outside. He needs to take these sheaves and he has an obligation to announce it for whoever lost these sheaves. Simply, what Rashi is trying to tell us is that the words ma'almim alumim, this is something that the student, the Talmud, hadn't learned yet, and therefore Rashi brings from the Targum that the meaning is ma'aserin asarin, tying knots. And then Rashi explains that what are these alumim? This is referring to, it means omrin, it means sheaves, as is evident from the proofs of that Rashi brings further. So in other words, together ma'almim alumim in the pasuk would mean they are making knots, they're making bundles of stalks of grain, and that is sheaves. So we need to understand. Number one, we know that the style of Rashi usually is only to write kitargumoy without quoting the wording of the Targum. He relies that the student is going to look himself into the Targum, so why is it over here that Rashi needs to quote the words of Targum? Number two, Rashi says ma'almim alumim after saying kitargumoy, that it refers to ma'aserin asarin. Rashi then translates the word alumim as meaning omrin, as meaning sheaves. Seemingly these two things should have been in two different Rashis, two different Dibra Maschils. First is ma'almim alumim, which is, as the Targum renders it, tying these knots, and then the word alumim itself really is referring to sheaves. Number three, discussed many times, that when Rashi brings two proofs, it's when one proof alone isn't enough. So the question over here is, why isn't it sufficient to prove from the pasuk noisei alumoisov, especially that the second proof isn't even from Tanakh, rather it's, as Rashi himself says, Loshen Mishnah. Question number four, why is it relevant to quote from the pasuk also the words noisei alumoisov? Seemingly the word noisei is not adding anything in the proof. Rashi could have just brought a proof from a pasuk that says alumoisov. So too when Rashi quotes the Mishnah, again Rashi quotes more words seeming more than necessary. Rashi says va'alumois noitelu machros, he takes it and he announces what he had found. Seemingly just the words v'ho'alumois that's found in Baba Metzia would have been enough. And we know that Rashi is very particular in his wording, not a word more, not a word less. So the Rebbe says the explanation is as follows. Rashi over here is not only coming to tell us that the word ma'almim alumim means tying knots. Rather, Rashi's main concern over here is to tell us that alumim is these bundles, these sheaves. Why is that important? Yosef's dream is similar to what it says in regards to Paro's dream, that Yosef tells Paro that what Hashem is going to do, he had told the future, this nevuah, to Paro. So too over here, that Yosef's dream is telling the future, that his brothers would come bow down to him, just like their sheaves bowing down to his sheaf. This is why when Yosef goes ahead and tells his story, immediately his brothers tell him, are you going to rule over us? In other words, they understand the dream meaning in this way, and his father too, as the pasuk says, Shamar es hadover, he's waiting and anticipating to see when is this all going to happen. Says the Rebbe, based on this we understand that also the details of the dream are accurate and indicate on exactly what's going to happen and what the dream is telling us. This is why Rashi says that alumim is referring to sheaves. That means also the fact that what they were gathering, what they were bundling, is also relevant, because this fits very much with what eventually happened practically. And this is why they were particularly tying sheaves, not just tying anything. In Parshas Miketz, the Torah tells us how the dreams have been fulfilled practically, and what happens. First, there was a famine in the land of Canaan. The brothers of Yosef come down to Mitzrayim. Why? To buy produce, to buy grain. And since Yosef is the ruler, he is the one that's feeding, he's giving this grain from those sheaves, from those grain, the produce in Mitzrayim. And this is when his brothers bow down to him and buy the grain, the produce from him. And this is why we say that the words of the dream, which are hinting to the bowing of the brothers of Yosef to him, are specifically related to sheaves, meaning to produce, not just any sort of bundles or ties or knots of anything. And this is why we say that the pile, the sheaf of Yosef stood up, and the rest of them, representing the brothers, bowed down to his sheaf. Says the Rebbe, now we can also understand why it is that Rashi brings on the words ma'almim alumim, and he says kitargumay, as the Targum tells us, and he quotes the Targum Ma'asrin Asar, and the reason for this is because in addition to Targum Onkelos, there's also Targum Yerushalmi, who translates the words ma'almim alumim mikrichin krichon. Now that could also mean tying knots, but the word kricha could also mean, in addition to a knot, it could also mean wrapping something. Now according to Rashi, that what was being tied over here is specifically the stalks of grain. So therefore we must say that it actually means knots. Because when we're speaking about stalks of grain, it doesn't really make sense so much to say that they were wrapping the grain, rather we're tying the grain so they shouldn't scatter in the wind. This is why Rashi also quotes the wording of the Targum, of Targum Unkel saying Ma'asrin Asarin, to emphasize that Ma'almim Alumim, they're actually tying knots over here, and therefore it makes sense to say that what they were tying was, as we said, sheaves, piles of grain. However, if Rashi would have just said the word kitargumoy without adding what Targum actually says, so that would have included Targum Yerushalmi as well, one could have made that mistake to think that ma'almim alumim is not referring to making knots, rather to wrapping something, lashon kricha, wrapping. And then it would be difficult to say that we're speaking about sheaves. But since in Pshuta Shel Mikra we just said that according to Rashi, alumim has to be referring to sheaves, because only then is it really going to fit with the dream, with all of its details that they were coming for the produce, and because of that they bow down to Yosef. This is why Rashi first explains that ma'almim alumim means ma'asrin asarin, that the Targum says they're tying knots, which would fit very much with tying stalks of grain. On the other hand, since what's forcing Rashi to say that it means as Targum Onkelos does, and Ma'asrin Asarin specifically, why do we have to say it that way? Because we want to translate alumim as sheaves, specifically referring to grain. This is why Rashi puts the two things, both the Ma'asrin Asarin and that it's referring to Amrin, into one Rashi, rather than splitting them up into two separate Rashis. Says the Rebbe, but we could still ask, from Targum's words Ma'asrin Asurin, fine, we can understand now that alumim, similar to the word ma'almim, means knots, tying something, and that's a simple meaning, because ma'almim, alumim are both from the same shaydish. So ma'almim would be tying, and alumim would be then being tying that bundle, that knot. But according to that, ma'almim, alumim could technically just be meaning tying any bundle, any knot of anything. Now, even though, yes, it could include sheaves, stalks of grain, but then, and then the dream would make sense, as we said before, but seemingly not necessarily does alumim have to then be referring specifically to sheaves, to piles of grain, and therefore maybe again it's not 100% accurate. So Rashi says that the word alumim itself actually specifically refers to sheaves. It's not only meaning a bundle or a knot of something. That's why Rashi brings as a proof from the pasuk noisei alumoisav. And we asked before, why does Rashi also need the word noisei? Because it's specifically the word noisei alumoisav that's going to prove that we're speaking about the pile of a sheaf, a pile of produce. Because otherwise, if alumim just means a knot, what would it mean? Noisei, carrying knots. And therefore Rashi says, adds the word noisei, from which we can understand that aluma is actually referring to a sheaf of grain. But Rashi is not happy with just bringing that pirush, because we could still say that alumois maybe does mean knots, and what we're referring to perhaps is sacks that are knotted, that are tied, that contain kernels of grain after they were threshed, after they were separated, but not that alumois is actually referring to piles and sheaves of stalks of grain. Therefore Rashi brings another example from the Mishnah. V'alumois noitelu machris. The context over there is that we need to return something when, if it has a siman, if it has a sign, or at least if the place where it was left could be a sign. So sometimes people would leave something, if it's very heavy, you'll leave it in its place and it's not rolling around, therefore the place could be a sign. So since we're discussing over here not only the word alumis, we're trying to understand the context of what's going on, because that's going to be the proof that the alumis that we're talking about is sheaves, is piles of grain that are not just rolling around. And therefore, from here we see more clearly what we're talking about: a big pile of grain that's tied together. And over here in this case is the words of the Mishnah, as Rashi himself emphasized, the word of the Mishnah, which Mishnah generally is clear-cut halacha. And in halacha, the Tana is very, very medayik to speak in a very, very clear and way that could be understood. In Torah Sheba'al Peh, generally the halacha is much more explicit than in Torah Shebeksav. So it's understood, and when we say the word alumois over here, it clearly has to have a clear meaning, and therefore we're speaking about something that's usually going to be heavy. And what would that be? A big pile of stalks of grain, which is a sheaf. Rashi, on the other hand, doesn't suffice just with this proof, because we may still say, fine, that's in the language of the Mishnah, but a Lashon HaPasuk might be different when it uses the term alumim. And therefore Rashi brings from Tanakh, the word noise, alum moisav, and in fact that's his main proof, and that's why he brings it first. Says the Rebbe from the Chassidus from this Rashi, in Rashi, it's explained in Torah in this week's Parsha, that the Avoda of Ma'almim Alumim, spiritually speaking, is the birur of the sparks that had fallen down to be separated as a result of Shviras HaKelim, and the job was to elevate all of these sparks, to be all included in Malchus Datzilus. Through that they are united there and become one in the Achdus of Hashem, and that's the meaning of Ma'almim Alumim. Just like taking stalks, many stalks that need to be gathered together and tied together in one bundle, the same thing happens with these sparks that we're elevating to the world of Atzilus, the Achdus Hashem. This idea of birur anitzos, to elevate them into the Achdus of Hashem, applies also to neshamas as explained in Torah. So the avoid of ma'almim alumim, where does it happen? Simply out in the field, and you need to have a special involvement to go out into the field, the place of those stalks where they're spread out, scattered, and we need to be involved in gathering them and tying them together. So here is the avoid of how we need to be involved in avodas habirurim. In addition to the avoid of the person to gather all of the sparks that are scattered by himself, and to elevate them that they should all be united with Achdus Hashem through his avoid of Torah and mitzvahs, there's also an avoid that a person needs to go out from the place where he lives, out into the field, to be involved over there with the avoid of ma'almim alumim, to gather all the sparks that are scattered in the world. And this is the avoid of dealing with other people, to go out of your own daladamois, to deal with the people that are still in the chutz on the outside, to bring them back to do tshuva, to be makar of them, to avoid this Hashem, to his Torah, and to the luminary of Torah, which is Pnimius HaTorah, Ilana the Chaya, the tree of life. And this is what the Rabbeim instituted, to send shluchim to various different places, even far places in the world, to gather all these sparks that are scattered there, to spread the mayonis of Chassidus, to reveal the mayonis of Chassidus. So Rashi tells us, ma'almim alumim, as the Targum tells us, is ma'asrin asarin, which means tying knots. That teaches us that the avoid of elevating these sparks has to be in a way of ma'asrin asarin, to elevate them, that they should all be connected, attached, tied to their source. Not only kricha, like we said before from the Yerushalmi, which may be wrapped, but rather it needs to be a permanent knot. In other words, the way you impact the other person is that he should be mukusher to his avodas Hashem in such a strong, permanent way that the ruach shtus, the spirit of foolishness, and all the other winds blowing in the world should never disconnect them chaz v'shalom from derech haTorah. What's the way to go about it? Rashi tells us. What's the eitzah? Rashi tells us, after saying ma'asrin asarin, Rashi says omrin, which are sheaves, which are piles of stalks of grain gathered together, tied together. In other words, if you want the ma'almim alumim should be in a permanent way, you need to first deal with stalks. That means you're dealing with produce. When you sow these things, you can plant them and they should produce further more and more. In other words, you have to work with the other person in a way that he should be toifeach hamanas la'atfiach, that he himself will bring his own environment closer to avodas Hashem, and then you're sure that your avodah is going to endure, is going to last. Then the pasuk says, all of your sheaves surround and bow down to my sheaf. In other words, the shleimus avodah in affecting another person is when you achieve and you bring even that person should also come to the sheaf of Yosef HaTzadik, the ruler of Mitzrayim, referring to the Nasi Adoir. In other words, bringing the other person also to be connected. Excuse me. Having that ishtachavoya and bittul to the Nasi. Says the Rebbe, we discussed many times, that the day of Shabbos is connected both to the week beforehand. As we say, if you work on Erev Shabbos, you'll have what to eat on Shabbos. It's also connected to the week afterwards, as the Zohar tells us. that Shabbos is a bracha for the whole following week. In other words, Shabbos connects the previous week and the following week. In many years, Parshas Vayeshev falls out on the Shabbos between the Yom Agul of Yutas Kislev and the days of Chanukah, like in the Kvis, when the Rebbe is saying the sicha. Says the Rebbe, based on what's known that the Parshas of the week are connected to the time that we read them, it's understood that this Hayrah of the Parsha is connected to the Chag Agul of Yutas Kislev as well as to the days of Chanukah. Says the Rebbe, so too in this Hayrah that we're speaking about Ma'almim Alumim, this is Shtadlus, to gather all the sparks that are scattered outside of each and every person, especially in the chutzah in the literal sense, to bring people back to tshuva. This is the common theme between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah. The explanation is, one of the main things the Alter Rebbe was involved with specifically was making Balit Tshuva. There's a famous story where the Alter Rebbe said to the Mittel Rebbe in connection to a dream that the Mittel Rebbe had, that when he heard from the Bezritcher Magid a mashal regarding tzaddikim and Balit Tshuva, it was engraved in him the concept that you need to be makar of each and every yid. And for 5 years he was traveling from place to place, both in an open way and in a hidden way, to be ma'oder, to be makar of yid and to Torah and mitzvahs. After the Gula of Yutas Kislev started the Avoda of Yafutzum and Hiskashrus Chutza to be poil, even in the outside, the Yafutzum and Hiskashrus spreading the well springs in the greatest, broadest way. So from here we understand that the Hayrah of Ma'almim Alumim B'soich HaSada in the field, in the outside, is even more so after the Gula of Yutas Kislev. So to the Hayrah of Neiros Chanukah, it's explained in Chassidus that the reason why the mitzvah of Neiros Chanukah is to put it at the door of the house on the outside is because the idea of the Neiros is to illuminate, to be mevader also the chutz, also the darkness, also the Rishos Harabim, also the Shalosh Klubas Hatameyos, these mountains of separation. That means to elevate the sparks of Shalosh Klubas Hatameyos, which is basically the Avoda of Tshuva. So through this Avoda of Ma'almim Alumim, of gathering all of these sparks that are found in the chutzah, by being Mekar of Yidin Ta'aviyim Shabashamayim. So when Yidden do tshuva, as we know, Miyadei Negolin, Bege'ula Amitis V'Ashlema, through Mashiach Tzedkeinu, B'Karev Mamash.